So how do we take the great discoveries we've spent billions or trillions of dollars making in the lab and then actually translate them into practical applications for individuals? Whether you're a doctor in the clinic providing care to a patient, or whether you are a patient themselves struggling to get an appointment, how do we deliver on the promise of bringing these discoveries into your hands? And we've done a very bad job of this to date. It takes on average 17 years to get a product technology discovery from the lab into patients' and doctors' hands. 17 years. Wow. We don't have that kind of time right now, right? And so we're in a mental health crisis. We're in an addiction crisis. We're in an opioid crisis. There's epidemics galore, right? And how do we get solutions out to people faster?
Welcome to Modern Enlightenment, a sanctuary for your soul, where we'll go on a path of personal and spiritual development. I'm Austin Mao.
And I'm Chuchu Wang. We are your companions on this journey of self-discovery and spiritual connection.
Join us as we delve into the fusion of modern psychotherapy, neuroscience, psychospirituality, and shamanic plant sacrament ceremonies, exploring the transformative potential of psychedelics for the mind, body, and spirit.
Our mission is to guide you to a place of profound awareness where emotions can be felt.
Together, let's illuminate the way to a brighter, more enlightened existence.
Modern Enlightenment, where your journey to inner peace begins.
All right, welcome to another episode of Modern Enlightenment. I'm joined by Dr. Dave Rabin, MD, PhD, who's a board-certified psychiatrist, neuroscientist, entrepreneur, and inventor, who's also the chief medical officer and one of the executive directors of Apollo Neuroscience, right? I'm so excited to be here with Dave.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah. The context in which we got to know each other was really fun. It was a group of founders and entrepreneurs who were psychedelically curious, right? At an event down in Mexico. And before that, I remember hearing about you. I think I saw you at MAP Psychedelic Science in Colorado, and remember being inspired to include some of your research and your presentations that you created for your talks into some of my own talks. And so sitting with you here in this moment, I'm just thrilled to have a conversation with you about illumination, about what you're doing with Apollo, about this bridge between science and enlightenment.
Well, that's one of my favorite topics, so I'm excited to dive in.
Awesome. I'd like to just maybe start from the beginning and just get a sense of how you became this expert in neuroscience and with a focus on psychedelics, but then going into not just psychedelic science, but also wearables that as an inventor. So I'd love to hear your story.
Sure. I mean, personally, it really started with a early curiosity at a very young age around dreams. And when I was a very young child, I remember probably like in the age range of like 4 to 7 years old, I had a lot of vivid dreams. And I didn't realize this at the time, of course, but as I got older, I realized that many people had dreams like this. But when I was a kid, I noticed that, with my brothers in particular, that sometimes I would have these very vivid dreams. They weren't bad dreams per se. They were just dreams that were really real seeming to me. And they were hard to distinguish my experiences, my dreams from the experiences I had when I was awake. And so I would notice that this was happening because I would find myself referencing things that had happened in my dreams in conversations with my little brothers or with my friends. And they'd be like, "What the hell are you talking about?" And I'm like, "Oh, that didn't happen in our shared waking reality. That happened when I was asleep." And that really started to spark interest in what dreams were, but just an very early, childlike approach with childlike curiosity. And then as I got older, going on to like the 7, 8, 9-year-old self, I started to have more nightmares, and those felt really real and scary. I started to ask my parents about those experiences, and my parents, of course, being trying to make sure that I didn't become afraid of sleep, which is, like many parents do with their kids. They just said, "Oh, don't worry about dreams. They're not real." And so that, it was helpful. It made me not afraid of sleep. At the same time, I kept having vivid dreams, and it wasn't every night, but it was often enough, like once or twice a month. And I started to feel that the realness of these dreams was different than the realness my parents were talking about our waking life. And it just kind of forced me to ask the question again, with like a childlike curiosity of like, maybe the adults don't know what the word real really means. And maybe we need to do a little deeper dive into that. And so as I became older, I started to read more science fiction and develop an interest in neuroscience and chemistry and biology, and just trying to understand the brain, the body, sleep. That developed more and more over time. But when I was in high school, I really wanted to study dreams as a professional. I was like talking to my dad, and he's like, "What do you want to do when you grow up, son?" And I'm like, "I want to study dreams." And he's like, very wise man. And he's like, that's great and all, but you're not going to make a lot of money studying dreams as a scientist. You should, if you're interested in becoming a doctor and seeing patients, you can still study what you want to study, but you'll actually have a stable financial life. And I started to think about that more. And, I thought, he has a good point. And so I started to study, rather than dreams, stress, and started to look at stress as something that impacted dreams, because I had noticed that when I was experiencing stress during my day, or like watching a scary movie at night, that the content of my dreams would change, and sometimes drastically change. And it would take on some of the content of my stress, or of like a scary movie, for instance, that a lot of people have experienced. And fast forward, I ended up studying stress and chronic stress, and how that changes the way that we make meaning of the world and our experiences and ourselves, probably starting in about 2003, 2004. I started studying chronic stress, and it's about 20 years ago. And I became fascinated by the way the body adapts to stress, and how certain stressors can push us to excel, and other stressors in certain situations, sometimes the same stressors, can push us towards illness. And that became really interesting to me. And so I spent about 20 years studying stress. And then in 2012, I was in medical school and doing research on stress. And I started to work with a lot of veterans and traumatized individuals who are struggling with very severe PTSD. And I noticed that the treatments we were taught to use, that were by the book treatments in medicine, were actually not helping most of these people. And I started to ask more questions about, what can we do better for these people? And maybe the treatments we have available, which are leaving like 70% of these people who are ever diagnosed with PTSD symptomatic for life, like they're really not doing a good job at treating these people. Maybe there are other ways we can help get to the source, like the root cause of what PTSD is. And as I started to think about trauma in this way, I started to look outside the box at Eastern techniques, breathwork, meditation, yoga, mindfulness, enlightenment practices, to the point of this show, and then tribal techniques of different plant medicines, and of course, looking at psychedelic assisted therapy, and seeing the early trials that were coming out around psilocybin for depression and MDMA for PTSD and cannabis for PTSD. I became thoroughly fascinated, because psychedelics in a lot of ways were introducing waking dream states. And this was really, it was like light bulb went off. It was like, wow, maybe I can study dreams the way I always wanted to, but it's through the lens of psychedelic medicine that is actually what allows me to start to dive into this in a deeper way. And so I really did dive into it in a deeper way, and started to study how psychedelics work in the brain, and why they work, and what people experience when they're having these psychedelic medicines in their bodies, and the transformations that can occur in certain settings and in other settings not, and why. And, again, long story short, that kind of led me into studying ways to bring forth some of the benefits of psychedelics, like radical safety and self-acceptance, without requiring a drug, which led to my interest in technology, AI, wearables, and that led to the development of Apollo.
Wow. I really find that so fascinating, because a couple of days ago, I rewatched Inception, right? And which I think
one of my favorites.
I think it's one of the most cool films ever made, about how people are doing a dream heist, right? And going into different layers of a dream. And I remember as a kid reading Sigmund Freud's something about interpretation of dreams, and then studying lucid dreaming. And so I have a personal connection with this because I was also very fascinated by dreams. And in a way, you dreamt of dreaming, right? You dreamt of studying dreams, which is super cool. But then dreams to like stress to psychedelics, there's a thread all the way through that of connection here, right? It's how does the mind interpret and interact with the outside world based on its own internal dynamics is how I'm interpreting it. Does that land for you?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And just to add to that, that as I started to understand what psychedelic experiences are, history is very powerful to learn from. We often forget our history very quickly in human society and tend to repeat the same mistakes of the past, try to reinvent the wheel all the time, which is one of the biggest mistakes that we make, I think, in society. But ultimately, if we look back to the origins of the term psychedelic, it doesn't actually mean anything about drugs. Psychedelic, the word means psyche, mind, delos, to show or to reveal. And it was coined by Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond in the 1950s, I believe, to create a new term that helped us to understand what happens when you take a psychedelic drug, but which we didn't have a good explanation for at that time. But what's really fascinating to me about that, again, is that it's not about drugs. It's about mind-revealing states. States like going back to Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, some of the most famous psychoanalysts of our time, and understanding what they were talking about, which is to reveal what is lingering or living within our subconscious and unconscious material. Everything that lies beneath the surface of our awareness on a regular basis is like subconscious and unconscious, but it still exists. And so if we ignore it, then we are blind to it. And if we can understand that it's there and embrace it and dive in and be willing to take the leap of popping open the hood of our consciousness car and see what's going on underneath, right? Or looking under the surface to see the parts of the iceberg that are not apparent when you're on the top of the Titanic, right? You could start to avoid the accident that then ultimately results in people's suffering. And so dreams are so fascinating to me in a lot of ways, because when people are asked, have you ever had a psychedelic experience? Most people will say no. But I would argue that everyone has had a psychedelic experience, because if you've had a dream, in dreams, that's exactly what's happening. Our subconscious and unconscious material is being actively revealed to us in ways that we were not aware of before, through the process of the feeling safe enough to fall asleep and subdue our ego or our conscious selves and the part of us that's aware and protecting us on a regular basis. And so dreams to me are so fascinating to tie it all together, in that they are some of the very first psychedelic experiences that we all have as human beings.
Totally. I think a lot of people get hung up on this word psychedelic, and even more of a hang up is the term hallucinogen, right? And then drug, right? Like these different layers of really loaded terminology that people associate with. And some of the words that you used that I think I really pick up on is the word ego and the word protector, right? Because I think we're in a place now where the science is bridging the world with the history, right? The history and the Lucian mysteries, that Jamie Wheel writes about, or Brian Moresky writes about in The Immortality Key, and how ancient Greeks and Egyptians and Christians used mind-altering substances to create more spiritual connections and connections within society, right, at the top echelons of society. And now the science is showing us that, I think you actually had some slides in a presentation I saw around the default mode network being quieted, which is the patterning section of our brain that governs these quote unquote protectors, right? To use IFS language, internal family systems language, like these protective parts that are protecting us from ourselves, right? From the deeper feelings that are underneath.
Yeah, from pain, protecting us from pain.
Exactly. But that's the key, right? It's like there's this saying that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. And it's really protecting us is from imagined pain. What Buddhism says is that anything but this present moment is falsehood, doesn't exist, right? The past is no more. The future doesn't exist yet. The only thing that is true is now. And so when we feel suffering from the trauma of the past, or feel stress about our anxiety about what could happen in the future, we're literally living a lie in that place, right? And that's the super fascinating thing about this body of work that you're studying and that I'm facilitating. It's that ultimately, the way I see it is people are being directed towards this present moment, which is also where psychology is going in its third wave of psychology. It's like Gestalt, right? It's like, let's be here now. Sure, you could have had all this fucked up stuff that happened in the past, right? But how do you relate to it now? How does it affect your life now? Who are you in this moment now?
Yeah, absolutely. And can we, because this is what you're describing so accurately, is really like so universal as a part of the human experience. No one is immune to it. And it's really, brings up this idea of through the practice of self-awareness, which is these ancient practices from Eastern and tribal medicine, like meditation, mindfulness, yoga, and breathing, and all the like, right? Can we, soothing touch is another perfect example, can we teach ourselves to be aware of, non-judgmentally aware of when the past is infiltrating our present and therefore dictating our future, right? Because it always is trying to. We've all had past challenges that if you look back hard enough, whether you're willing to admit it or not, if you look back hard enough, we've all had past challenges that we can identify in some way as trauma, whether it's been being picked on in school or being invalidated by your parents or not being accepted by your community for whatever reason, your emotions being invalidated when you're having intense feelings. That is trauma. And we don't think about it necessarily that way, but it's trauma because it is impacting our biological memory of experience, and our body stores that information, right? Like Bessel van der Kolk talks about it, and the body keeps the score very well, which is like, these experiences get stored not just in our memory, not just in our default mode network, not just in our sense of self, but all the way through into the way our cells record memory of stress and fear and safety.
Energetics.
And yeah, epigenetics, right? Which is something else we can talk about, which is fascinating, and how trauma impacts and imprints epigenetic code, and then how you can reverse it, which is a discovery that we made in 2022 by studying how MDMA works to heal people from PTSD. And so, yeah, it's like, I think it really comes down to this idea of bringing everything back to the present, which is, can we remember as often as possible to be aware, to be mindfully aware without judgment of how the past is infiltrating our perception of the present and therefore dictating our future. And as soon as we can be aware of it, which is where all healing starts, then we start to be able to intervene and stop the cycle of trauma. But if we neglect it or ignore it or suppress it, repress it, it governs our entire lives.
Totally. Everything begins with awareness. It reminds me of this quote by Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Buddhist teacher. He wrote 118 books, and I think passed like 2 years ago or something. And I was reading a book by him called How We Fight. And he gives this form of an apology that I think is, to me, is the very best form. He says, "I'm sorry. In that moment, I wasn't mindful or skillful enough to meet you where you were, to help provide for your needs." Right? And that's really what it boils down to. Like, when I've been angry, or when I've stormed out the door, or slammed the door or something like that, or said something that I would later on regret, really what was happening is, I don't think of myself as an asshole or a bad person. I think of myself as a good person. And I think everybody does, right? In that moment, I wasn't mindful. I wasn't aware of myself enough, and I wasn't skillful enough to meet my own awareness at that time, right? And sometimes when we're super under-resourced, the most skillful thing we can say is, I need to pause because I am under-resourced to be able to provide you what you need, right? And so you're right, like the awareness is the first stepping stone. And on top of that, like the skillfulness to actually use that information, not only with equanimity, aka non-judgment, but with connection, right? Because we live in this connected world.
Yeah, absolutely. You nailed it.
So I'm really curious because I always have this question in my mind, like, you're a scientist, right? And by the way, I used to be, a software engineer and CTOs. I majored in math, so also quite left brain, really loved theoretical physics. So I think I align on some of this. And I imagine that in your own pursuits of understanding, right? And you've trained in with ketamine, which involves some experiential training. I imagine that you've dived into yourself quite a bit. Yeah. So I'm extraordinarily fascinated by the dialogue between data, like quantitative data, and actual real world stories, because you're working with people that have deep traumas. And what's that like to be with somebody as they go from, let's say, suicidality to an invigorated life, and then record that as data, and report that as data. What's that like for you?
I mean, it's a great question. I think in short, in the moment, it's very present focused, right? And so in the moment, we're not thinking about data at all. It's sincerely guiding somebody through that journey is one of the single most rewarding experiences that I've ever had in my life. And as hard as it is to at times be present with people who are struggling that much and suffering that much, holding their hand home to the other side is one of the most powerful healing experiences even for us, even for the person who is holding that person's hand. And that's all it's about. That's where it starts, which is, again, not about data. It's about applied data more than anything else, which is the way I think about data is there's a hierarchy, right, of information. I like to call it the hierarchy of information. So it's you have information that is just stuff. It's just info, right? And data points that aren't organized any way. They can be true, they can be not true, they can be relevant, irrelevant, useful, not useful. They're disorganized, just data. It's like what we train AI with, right? And then you organize data, and then data organization times organization gets you to information. Information is somewhat useful. It's organized data, right? It's all the points that you have, and then they're put together in a way that starts to give you some picture of what's going on, but not the full picture. And then we have to organize information around context. And then you start to organize and time. And then you organize information. And as you organize information, you get to knowledge, right? Knowledge is that level of, okay, I start to know stuff about the world that I can draw conclusions from. Drawing conclusions from data and information is a very common error that people make that gets us into a lot of trouble, because data and information are lacking a significant amount of organizational context and framework to be able to draw conclusions about life. Knowledge is also not all the way there, right? So knowledge organized times time gets you to wisdom, right? And wisdom is the penultimate knowing, where you no longer doubt. There's no room for doubt, because you have organized your data and your information and your knowledge so much that you know certain things, and you're not doubting or questioning yourself in the moment anymore. And so wisdom is one of those things that we really can't get from Google or from information searches. You really have to live it. And it's applied knowledge. And just like theoretical physics is, I'm also a huge fan of theoretical physics and theoretical math. It's fascinating, but it doesn't mean anything in life until we actually put it to the test in life and we apply it. Then you see how much of it is actually true, right? How much of it is actually meaningful in life, in real experience. And so if we think about information, the hierarchy, information, and knowing in that way, then the goal is always wisdom. And when we're delivering care to people in the context that you described of helping somebody who's suicidal, at rock bottom, hopeless, helpless, all the way through to a healed person, we are not thinking about data or information or knowledge. It's really about, what does my inner wisdom, my intuition tell me from being present with this person in the moment that they're suffering, that they really need right now, right? Not what was I taught to tell them in response to X input from them or output from them. It's, what do they need from me right now? And that is not something you can necessarily read in a book, right? And so I think that is the nuance that we don't necessarily teach people because it's hard to teach. It's something that has to be earned and learned through life experience, which is why you graduate from medical school and you're not the best at seeing patients yet. You have to do your residency training and your apprenticeships and your internships and your see patients with experts over and over again, thousands of patients. And then finally you get to a point several years later where you're like, okay, I got this. Like, I know how to do this. I know how to help people heal.
Totally. It makes sense. And it's really resonating with me because, Ceremonia is one of the few pre-approved training centers in Colorado to license and train other practitioners. And I'm developing the curriculum for that, co-developing the curriculum of that with other very intelligent people. And so I'm in this position of codifying the quote unquote wisdom that I've learned and others have learned to support in the psychedelic space. And the extraordinarily challenging thing about that is this is the Wild West. It's totally new, right? We have wisdom keepers, such as shamans which have oral traditions passed over thousands of years, and psychedelic assisted therapists, right? And large bodies of work from psychology and mindfulness. But at the same time, we are in this space, like offline, you and I were sharing, like what an exciting time we're in. Yeah, where it's just like it is such an exciting time because of legalization, because of studies, because of the embracing of psychedelic healing that's coming out. And at the same time, with that newness comes A, tons of opportunity, B, tons of responsibility, and C, tons of risk, for messing up. Something that you said really struck me. It's that when you are supporting somebody to go from suicide to healed, right? It is one of the most healing experiences for you as the facilitator, right? I wonder if you could speak more on that aspect.
Yeah, we talk about this a lot in medicine and the practice of healing as a healer, which is that we learn so much from our patients about ourselves because of the universality of human experience. And it's very easy when you don't work with patients and people who are suffering on this journey to think that when you look at these people who are struggling from the outside, that's not me, that couldn't be me, right? I can't relate to this other person, right? This couldn't happen to me. And that is a fundamentally false premise because suffering is universal. And there are a million minds around us, like Minesweeper in the advanced version of Windows or expert mode in Windows, right? From the back in the day, right? Where you can literally in a split second accidentally click on the wrong box and explode your whole life, right? And so one of the ways that happens in clinical care, especially in mental health as a primary example, and especially in psychedelic medicine as a primary example, is that if we don't do our own work in advance of caring for others and expand our own awareness of what's going on in our subconscious material, in our unconscious material with our past trauma, if we aren't able to humble ourselves enough to work with ourselves first, then we are accidentally carrying our own baggage into someone else's healing experience. And there's no room for that in healing. While I get my own healing as a side effect of working with others to heal, I'm not going into those experiences for me. I'm going into the experience solely to be present with that person. If I accidentally haven't done my own work and I bring my baggage in with me to somebody else's experience, then it's very easy for me or whoever it is who's walking in with your own baggage to accidentally confuse your baggage with their baggage, or for them to confuse your baggage with their baggage. And then it becomes a really confusing and convoluted scenario where healing becomes obstructed. Like the path becomes obscured, like a dense fog. And, anybody who's driven through San Francisco in a foggy day or, been in those kinds of situations, like walking down a forest and there's intense, thick fog, when you can't, or skiing, right? It's scary. When you can't see what's in front of you, it is bewildering and it can really throw you off and you can easily go down the wrong path. And this is no different in the healing experience. And so the critical piece of it is to go back to something you said earlier about doing your own work first. Like a lot of what the training that we do is, and why for mental health practitioners like psychiatrists, it was historically required for us to do our own therapy before doing therapy with others, is because you have to understand what baggage you're carrying before you walk into the door and help somebody with their own bags. And if you don't, right? Like if your hands are already full when you walk in that door with your own stuff and you haven't left it outside, how are you going to help somebody carry their stuff? It's just not possible. And then the fog sets in and you're like, well, I have no idea where to go. If you train yourself through self-work practices, like even just going to talk therapy with a therapist you trust and working on yourself to learn what you're carrying, and you leave it behind when you walk into somebody else's healing scenario, then all of a sudden the fog lifts and the path becomes abundantly clear. Like the path to healing is obvious. And it doesn't mean the other person sees it. It means we see it. And if we see it, we can kind of take their hand and guide them back. And in that process of understanding how to meet somebody where they are and guide them back in a selfless way to the healing path for themselves, what you start to realize as a healing provider, particularly in mental health or in psychedelic work, in shamanic work, and, with Indigenous wisdom and all of that, which is so important. And now finally, thank goodness, integrating into Western medicine in slowly but surely, you start to learn so much about the universality of human experience and suffering. And when by helping somebody else through their suffering, you realize, oh, wow, I have also felt that. Even if I haven't been in the same situation, I have also felt those feelings. And when you can make that connection, you all of a sudden realize that you're healing yourself by healing others.
There's so much to unpack here. Psychedelic healing, I've heard often related to as 10 years of therapy in 10 hours. And if you go to a therapist and that therapist is having a bad day, not a huge deal. You'll be fine. You go to a psychedelic session and your facilitator is having a bad day, well, there could be tremendous life-altering impact on you as a person. But I'm going to add to what you're saying with my own perspective, which is that it's more than about baggage. It's how you handle your baggage, right? It's content versus process. Because I have baggage. I've done tons of inner work. I still have a ton of baggage. I'm not sitting at...
Yeah, we all have it. It's like a lifelong thing we carry.
Exactly. And so it's not incumbent on the facilitator to be baggageless, right? It's to come in with the humility and be the embodiment of the process of how they meet that baggage, right? So that we are modeling for the participants, for the patients, how to meet themselves, right? And I think that's something that is missing in the therapeutic field as a whole. Like in therapy, there's often a distance between the therapist and the patient. It's in fact part of therapy training, yeah? Whereas in the psychedelic space, there's so much of what is called transmission that happens, right? What I think of as the energetic transmission of my beingness to the people in the field and vice versa, that if I held a certain level of distance, that distance would actually not be in service of someone's healing, because I would be breaking the connection that is very clearly there,
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, right? So there's a very fine line that we have to walk around what you're talking about, which is like energy transmission or transfer or transference, which we talk about in psychotherapy, countertransference, and boundaries, right? Because for me to be an objective healing guide and successfully bring somebody on their path, there have to be some boundaries, right? Like there have to be some boundaries, because if I get too personally invested and attached to an individual, then I lose my objectivity. And my objectivity as a therapist, as a psychiatrist, as a mental health, healer is critical to the healing process. The way we describe it to patients oftentimes is like, your life is like a train and you're the conductor and your train is going through life. And as your therapist, we're like passengers on your train, except we are looking at your life out different windows than you are, right? So we see different things that you don't see. And then through that objective lens of not being you, of not being too close to you, close enough to make sure that you trust us, but not so close to you that you forget and we forget that there is a psychotherapeutic relationship, which is important to note because this often happens with untrained providers in the psychedelic space because those boundaries get crossed very quickly. Yeah. Or at least people try to cross those boundaries because they're looking for that unconditional love and trust. And the question becomes, can we as humans and as providers provide that unconditional love being a word that we typically don't use in Western medicine, right? It's first and foremost, put it out there that like, this is something that is not something we are taught to talk about. Totally, yeah. But can we provide that unconditional love and acceptance to our clients without getting sucked in to our clients' reality? Because it's really easy to get sucked in and lose your objectivity. And once you've lost your objectivity, then you're looking at their lives through the same window as they've been looking at their lives, and there's no altered perspective. And the challenge with that is that once you fall into that trap, that people, like, you are so close with that person that they might trust you a lot. They might trust you even more than they did as an objective figure, which is good that they trust you. But if you can't provide the objective feedback and service in the service of their healing from an outsider perspective, then the healing path again becomes obstructed and foggy. And so that's like the fine line that I would actually say is really well taught in Western mental health training, that is taught well in tribal training and in Eastern medicine training, but is not taught to most providers in the psychedelic underground. And that's what gets people into trouble. And that's actually one thing that I teach a lot about, is making sure that we take a trauma-informed approach where there's certain things we can do with people, like it's okay to hold somebody's hand. It's okay to, with consent, to put your hand on somebody's shoulder when they're having a hard time. Should you embrace and hug that person frequently during a session? Maybe not. Right. And it's not to say that hugs are bad. I'm like the soothing touch and hugs doctor. Like, I believe that hugs are more powerful and healing than most other things. And Hippocrates talked about the laying on of hands as a healing, one of those powerful healing techniques. But we have to be really careful to not lose objectivity.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And this conversation, I think, is hopefully illuminating for our listeners is, damn, this thing is complex, super complex. And while we're in an exciting time of great opportunity, it's bringing to light, like, even the availability of studying this, in the past 20 years is illuminating just how complex it is, right? And that's the difference between looking at the data versus actually looking at the practice and then teaching the practice, right? The data is like, psychedelics are the best thing since sliced bread for mental health, but the actual practices of it is a Minesweeper game, very, very advanced Minesweeper game.
Do you mind if I add one thing to that? Well, so I was going to say, that's where, when we talk about the hierarchy of knowing, the hierarchy of information, that's where we really benefit from respecting Indigenous wisdom. And Indigenous wisdom is pre-science. It's pre-Western science. And just because it's pre-Western science, for over 100 years, Western science has demeaned it, which is one of the biggest mistakes that we have made in our history of Western science and medicine, is that we have not respected Indigenous wisdom. And Indigenous wisdom, in a lot of ways, can be thought of as like intuitive wisdom. It's respecting that intuition that we all have as humans is real, and that there is an inner healing intelligence that wants us to heal. That Hippocrates talked about, the forefather of Western medicine talked about, the source of healing does not come from outside. It comes from always within the person who is seeking to be healed. And it is us as clinicians that are guides to not heal that person, but to remind that person how to heal themselves. And if we make the mistake of losing objectivity and calling ourselves the healer and identifying ourselves or the medicine itself as the source of healing, then we have already sabotaged the healing experience by, unintentionally most of the time, by disempowering the individually seeking to be healed to not remember where that healing comes from. It doesn't come from us. We are mere guides, right? We are facilitators to the healing process. And the medicine are tools that we can use to further facilitate the healing process. But the healing process is yours and it's mine and it's everyone's individual process that has to be illuminated like a light shining in when you've forgotten, like a spotlight, right? Shining in that shows you, wait, don't forget about this. You have this inside of you. It's not me. I'm the spotlight. You are the healer of yourself. And that is indigenous wisdom, right? That's what Hippocrates really taught, that Western medicine has completely forgotten about and commodified and into a business of medicine, which is not medicine. It's a business. There's a very distinct difference between healing, true healing, and business of medicine, right? And we should not confuse the two. And that's where, I think, to go back to what you said about this being one of the most exciting times in the history of mental health, that can't be understated. Like, this is one of the most exciting times in the history of psychiatry and mental health. The reason is not because of psychedelics and technology and all of these wonderful tools we have. That's part of it. The reason is because in Western medicine and science, we are finally starting to prove that Eastern and tribal practices are real, and then indigenous wisdom is real and valid. And as soon as we make that leap in the Western medical model to accept indigenous and tribal and Eastern healing practices, these multi-thousand-year-old practices, as real and valid and having worth, all of a sudden we become true healers because we understand the nature of what healing really is, which is guides to amplify and reignite the inner healing process of the individual who's seeking to be healed.
I think about Stanislav Grof in the preface to The Way of the Psychonaut. Stanislav Grof was, for our listeners, was a forefather of transpersonal psychology, psychedelic healing, holotropic breathwork, etc. And he writes that science is always catching up to what's actually real and to mysticism, right? Before the apple dropped on Newton's head, everyone didn't know about gravity, right? Thought it was the gods doing that. Before Galileo discovered that the Earth is revolving around the sun, everyone thought the complete opposite, right? And right now, the same thing is happening. Our Western medicine is catching up to this thousands of years. Like, the people in the Amazon must be like, I mean, guys, we already knew. Like, duh.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. And that's it. It's right. It's like, it's how do we catch up faster? And that's why it's so exciting. This time to be alive is so exciting. In my mind, one of the most exciting times ever, particularly for mental health, because we're starting to recognize the power of indigenous knowledge and wisdom and Eastern knowledge and wisdom that has frankly been systematically denied and ignored for a really long time. And it's resulted in this commodification of medicine as like a factory of healing, where patients are taught to rely on the factory to heal them, and the doctors and the providers and the medicine, and have forgotten that the source of healing comes from within. And that's why psychedelics are interesting, because they also illuminate that for us. They remind us, when used properly and thoughtfully and intentionally, psychedelic medicines have the capacity to remind us, as the MAPS trainers talk about, of which I'm also trained in, MDMA-assisted therapy and ketamine therapy, is what is that inner healer and how do we empower it? Rather than forcing healing down your throat, from my perspective, it's how do I meet you where you are using my intuitive wisdom and my medical knowledge combined? How do I meet you where you are to help reawaken or illuminate your ability to heal yourself?
It's beautiful. One of my favorite quotes is, holding paradox is one of the highest states of consciousness. And in a sense, and I say this with love, Dr. Dave, you're a walking paradox, because you deeply respect this ancient wisdom, and yet you are a modernist, you're an inventor, you're a chief medical officer of Apollo Neuroscience. And so I'd love to hear from you, about this product that you have, Apollo. I know you just shipped me one. I'm really grateful. And you have a new launch coming out. And so I want to hear about your modern take. The show is called Modern Enlightenment after all, but your modern take of how science and technology can support us into these elevated states that hundreds of years ago, or 50 years ago, we would have needed thousands of hours of meditation to get to.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think this is really one of my focuses and passions in my career, which is, it comes back to translational neuroscience, which is the kind of neuroscience that I practice and am trained in, which is I've done bench research. I've labored for hundreds of thousands of hours in the lab, but my passion is really around translation. So how do we take the great discoveries we've spent billions or trillions of dollars making in the lab, and then actually translate them into practical applications for individuals, whether you're a doctor in the clinic providing care to a patient, or whether you are a patient themselves struggling to get an appointment. How do we deliver on the promise of bringing these discoveries into your hands? And we've done a very bad job of this to date. Like, it takes on average 17 years to get a product technology discovery from the lab into patients and doctors' hands. 17 years.
Wow.
We don't have that kind of time right now, right? And there's great discoveries coming out all the time. And so we're in a mental health crisis. We're in an addiction crisis. We're in an opioid crisis. There's epidemics galore, right? And there's isolation, loneliness, right? Like, how do we get solutions out to people faster? And from working with psychedelic medicines and studying how they worked, particularly MDMA and ketamine therapy, which are some of the most well understood psychedelic medicines to date in the Western model. And then also from my work going back to the tribal cultures of Peru and the Shipibo culture in particular, and trying to understand how they had their understanding and wisdom around ayahuasca ceremony and healing of trauma in their language. What I've learned is so interesting, which is that we're all trying to do the same thing. It's all about teaching safety again, right? And when I say that, what I mean is that when you think about trauma and PTSD, whether you're looking at animal models of PTSD and trauma or mental illness, or you're looking at human examples in the real world, trauma is a learned fear disorder. PTSD is a learned fear disorder. How do you treat or address learned fear at the source? You relearn safety. It's just as simple as that. And that has biological implications to no end. Like, our whole stress response system gets conditioned all the way down to our epigenetic code of stress response genes like cortisol receptors when we experience trauma and fear, especially on an extended basis. And it changes the way our whole stress response system functions, all the way to the way that we think, and causes persistent tunnel vision and high heart rate and blood pressure and all these things, depression, anxiety, et cetera. And then we treat it with something like MDMA-assisted therapy in just 3 doses with 42 hours of psychotherapy over 12 weeks. And lo and behold, the molecule MDMA that works by amplifying safety learning in the brain in the psychotherapy setting is able to rapidly accelerate and catalyze the relearning of safety for people, so that, to break this down really simply, people feel safe enough to relearn and remake meaning around past traumatic events that have changed the way they see themselves in the world. So just sit with that for a minute, right? About how important safety is and how simple this understanding of learning around safety and fear is, which is also what Eric Kandel, very famous neuropsychiatrist, won the Nobel Prize for in 2000. We're in 2024. We still don't teach this stuff properly, right? So again, the importance of translation of discoveries. I thought, working with veterans at the University of Pittsburgh, what if we could use technology to, and this was with Rick Dovelin's blessing and him getting me into, and a few of my colleagues into, MDMA therapy training in 2016, with what we learned from MDMA therapy and general psychotherapy and Eastern and tribal practices around why and how much safety is critical to the healing process. What if we could create technology that can safely help us feel safe in our own bodies again? And the first thing that came to mind was touch, because soothing touch is the most powerful, instant, and nonverbal way that for over 50 million years, mammals have delivered and communicated safety to their newborn young. And to this day, women still hold their babies that are crying and soothe them with touch immediately and non-verbally to get this effect. It is hardwired into our nervous system. And so I thought, what if we can use technology that you can wear with you, take with you, to deliver these feelings of safety on the go and start to retrain and remind the body how to feel safe in situations that are currently making us feel afraid. And so what we discovered in the lab at the University of Pittsburgh was that we actually can do this. And music has been known to do this, again, for thousands of years. So I thought, what if we transpose music down into the frequency range that the touch receptors feel? So like deep bass, like what comes out of a subwoofer, which anybody who stood next to a subwoofer who's listening to this knows exactly what I'm talking about, because you feel it more in your body than you hear it in your ears. And it feels incredible. It can be even a spiritual experience, no drugs needed. And what if we can take that frequency range and deliver it straight to the body, and the body might know it and start to resonate with it in a very much physics governed way, right? Like sound waves are creating physical tactile experience through touch. And then the body feels it and says, oh, this feels like soothing touch, feels like a hug. It feels like ocean waves washing over me, feels like Om, it feels like a cat purring on my chest. Then will that start to train the body and remind the body to be calm and centered and soothed again? And it turns out that it worked. And we showed that in multiple clinical trials, about 6 of which will be published in the next year. And that became the Apollo technology that we released as a wearable in 2020. And now what's coming this year that I've been so excited about, because it's taken years for us to do this, is we've taken the technology from the Apollo wearable and we have unlocked the iPhone to be able to deliver this for free, this feeling of safety, to anyone who has an iPhone for free, and make it shareable so that you can feel safe immediately anytime you want for free with your friends. And if you have an iPhone and you're listening to this, or your friend has an iPhone, you can go and download the Apollo Neuro app. It's 2 words right now on your iPhone, and you can open it up, and for free, you can feel what I'm talking about. And it is an undeniable experience tapping into the hardwired safety pathways in the body and the brain.
All right. I've got my phone here. I'm doing that immediately after we get off. Thank you so much, Dave. Like, this whole talk has been awesome. And hearing you just share this, for those of you that are just on audio, I'm watching Dave light up talking about this, and I'm imagining you as a kid wanting to study dreams, right? And dreaming about that. And now going through this whole journey into medicine, but also into yourself, to arrive at a place where you're able to hopefully affect the masses in providing this technological, paradoxical form of feeling of safety. Beautiful. What a gift, man. Thank you. And
of course, it's a labor of love, truly.
Yeah. And there you go, using the word love again as a medicine man. So, which I love too. And you are a good hugger, by the way. Well, Dr. Dave, thank you so much for this talk. How can people find you if they want to get in touch?
I'd love to hear from people. So anybody who's listening to this who wants to get in touch with me, you can find me at my website at drdave.io or apollo.clinic. You can check out Apollo itself at wearablehugs.com, and you can find me on socials at Dr. David Rabin, and please do reach out.
All right. Beautiful. Well, once again, thank you for joining us on Modern Enlightenment. We'll be seeing you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Modern Enlightenment. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to check out our website, subscribe to our online community, and check out our social media links in the show notes for more resources and updates.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to stay connected with our upcoming episodes, where we continue to explore the intersection of modern science and spiritual wisdom. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep shining your light.